Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Edgar Wright's film, Hot Fuzz. This is the second film of the Three Flavours Cornetto trilogy following Shaun of the Dead and preceding At World's End, I think is the title of the film. So Hot Fuzz is a film that's really interested in things that are not as they appear to be. It's the story of Police Constable Nicholas Angel, played by Simon Pegg. He's an extremely good police officer. And I say that both in the sense of, like, he's good at his job, and he's sort of the ideal of what a police officer should be. So, as an American, my context for police officers, particularly right now in the 21st century, tends to be violence and incompetence. Nicholas Angel is not that. He is fully capable of deploying violence, but he prefers not to. He actually tries to teach his sort of protege partner, Danny Butterman, that the most important tool a police officer has is the notebook. So he is very much this sort of ideal police officer. But because he's such a high-achieving officer, like literally, I think his arrest record is like 400% higher than any other officer in the London Metropolitan Police. And so they send him to they promote him and send him to Sandford, Gloucestershire. Gloucestershire being one of the more sort of rural West Midlands counties of England. So this is a village. It's a small town, basically, and it's a very idyllic village. It is one village of the year many times. And the local establishment wants to keep it that way. They have a significant vested interest in making sure that everything remains idyllic, quaint, pastoral, rustic, etc., etc. The crime rate in Sandford is virtually non-existent. There's basically nothing for the police force to do, despite the fact that they have a chief of police, played by Jim Broadbent, Frank Butterman. Frank is his first name. I blanked on his first name for a second there. So Frank Butterman, chief of police. Then they have Danny Butterman, who's played extremely well by Nick Frost, one of Pegg's consistent acting partners. Danny Butterman loves movies, especially action movies, police-oriented action movies, and so he has these sort of notions about proper action and shit, as he puts it. There are 3 other police officers, including one who is the canine unit, basically. There are 2 sort of desk sergeants who are twins, and that's a source of many jokes throughout the early portion of the movie before that is revealed. And then there's 2 detective inspectors. For the most part, the people on this police force do very little. Like, they virtually do nothing, because officially there is no actual crime in Sandford. The problem is that Nicholas Angel shows up and he starts spotting things that are crimes. And then the accident rate goes through the roof. The accidents, as Nicholas very quickly comes to suspect, are not accidents, but are in fact murder. What Nicholas discovers over the course of the movie is that this is not a murderer. This is basically the entire village establishment. You've got Frank Butterman, but you've got the owner of the hotel he's staying at, you've got the leader of the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, you've got the doctor, you've got the priest, you've got shop owners, basically everybody who has a sort of vested stake in this community remaining village of the year. They are all collectively murdering anybody who even moderately threatens the village's idyllic aesthetic. So, for example, one of the first things that Nicholas does is kicks out a bunch of teenagers who are drinking in the local pub. We later find out that all of those teenagers are murdered by the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, the NWA. There's a living statue who shows up. This is a pretty popular thing in Britain, people who sort of dress in particular costumes or something like that, and then, like, they basically collect money for letting you take pictures with them, things like this. That guy is murdered just for being irritating, etc., etc. So this is a system in which the tranquility of the village is maintained by brutal, lethal violence. At the same time, the sort of additional central conflict is Nicholas's conflict, because he is so efficient and so effective as a police officer, because he's literally just incapable of turning off his work brain, right? And this is a thing he and Danny talk about extensively. Nicholas, we find out at the beginning of the movie that his relationship has broken up because he is so dedicated to the police service, not the police force. He does make that point that official vocab guidelines dictate you're supposed to use the term service instead of force because force is too aggressive. And the fact that he just sort of knows these regulations and says them throughout the movie is a good indication of this. Nicholas is so dedicated and so tunnel vision focused on being the best police officer he possibly can that there's no room in his life for anything else. So he has a very flat life. And Danny, who drinks a lot and watches a lot of action movies, again, basically convinces Nicholas that the way to start finding a balance is by getting drunk and watching action movies. And so Nicholas does sort of grow and make progress over the course of this movie, but he helps Danny to grow into a better, more responsible police officer by teaching him some of the skills that have made Nicholas such an amazing officer. So, I had said that this is a film fascinated with the idea that things are not what they appear. The most obvious example of this, of course, being that the accidents are in fact a series of coordinated murders by the Neighborhood Watch Alliance. So we've got a number of levels here of things not being what they appear. One is that the cover story, again, is just these are accidents when in fact they're murders. So that's a fairly straightforward one. That's a fairly straightforward example of something not being what it at least ostensibly is. The next sort of layer of this is that they initially think, Nicholas and Danny initially think that there is one murderer, and this point is actually made. They go into a shop to buy cornettos, hence the name of the trilogy. This is a recurring motif. But they go into this shop, and the shop owner says, "No luck catching them killers, then." And that's actually a really striking line. It's really, really clever because she is, in fact, a member of the Neighborhood Watch Alliance, and so she knows that there are more than one killer. So she says, "No luck catching them killers, then." And Danny says, "It's just the one killer, actually." And Nicholas's brain starts ticking. He doesn't immediately know what it means, but he knows that there was something there he has missed. And then he realizes it's more than one killer. So, again, we have that element of things not being what they seem. The reason that these murders are taking place is, again, not necessarily that it's not what it seems, but it's not initially clear what the motive for the murders is. So there is that sort of revelation aspect there. But I actually think there's a more interesting element here of what's not what it seems. Because this is a comedy. It's an action comedy. That's sort of officially how Hot Fuzz is billed. And I don't think that's entirely wrong, but I also think, ironically enough, it's a tragedy. Now, that's going to be a contentious claim, but there's a literary theorist named René Girard, and one of the things that Girard argues in his book Violence and Sacrifice is that the structure of tragedy is built on scapegoating and it's built on mimetic violence. And so there definitely is scapegoating here. This is a village that maintains its tranquility by identifying and sacrificing anyone perceived as a threat to it. So that mechanism of scapegoating exists here. And ironically enough, at the end of the film, Nicholas and Danny have to defeat the NWA in order to bring peace to the village. And so there is, again, this mechanism of scapegoating. They actually employ the very mechanism that the NWA employed for the same objective, right? Because the NWA, when they killed the kids who were drinking in the pub and got into legal trouble, when they killed the living statue, when they killed the previous police sergeant who Nicholas replaced, who was also asking questions, etc., etc. All of this was a scapegoating technique. If we eliminate this person, then the village will be perfect. This is the underlying logic of scapegoating. Nicholas and Danny and the rest of the police force, other than Frank Butterman, who actually joined them, the rest of the police joined them, the effective logic of defeating the NWA in the climactic gun battle between the two sides is, if we defeat the NWA with their use of violence, their self-appointed power to execute anyone they want to, then the village will be secure and safe. So this is an ironic inversion. This is what... So we have here, again, this scapegoating element. The NWA are scapegoated as creating the issues of violence and criminality in the village. But this also represents what Girard calls mimetic violence. So mimetic violence is in which the violence of one character in traditional tragedy, like going back to the Greeks and things like this, the violence of one character mirrors the violence of another character to the point where, if looked at from an objective perspective, it's difficult to tell them apart. Sorry, my cat is screaming. I don't know if the mic is picking that up. When looked at from an objective perspective, apart from the sort of value-laden assessments of a particular text, it becomes impossible to distinguish the two characters. And this, I think, happens in Hot Fuzz. Again, the NWA utilizes violence to purge the village of things they perceive, of people they perceive as undesirable. At the end of the film, Nicholas utilizes violence to purge the village of people he perceives as undesirable. Now, Nicholas's violence is not fatal. They injure people without killing them, and that's one of the very noticeable things as you watch the climactic extended gun battle at the end. It's not clear that anyone in the NWA is actually killed. And actually, we know that a lot of them survive because we get a sort of lineup of police mugshots at the end showing that they are still alive. But many of them are significantly injured. So Nicholas's violence is somewhat less severe, but it is, in effect, the same type of violence. There's a whole thing where Danny takes his supposedly dead body out of town and then basically says, go back to London. But Nicholas comes back and he goes into the evidence locker in the police station where they had just confiscated this massive arsenal from this farmer. And basically he gets shotguns, he gets assault weapons, he gets multiple pistols, he gets grenades. He just completely loads himself down with weapons and goes out into the village. And what we discover is that everyone in the NWA themselves is packing. Whether it's pistols, one guy has a sword, one guy has a blunderbuss, but then there's also people with shotguns, there's people with high-powered rifles, etc., etc. So it's this weird sort of spectrum of weaponry. And Nicholas and Danny wield those weapons on the one side. The NWA wield those weapons on the other side. And their violence is literally pitted head to head. And so this is mimetic violence. This is violence that mirrors violence. And if you watch that scene without the sort of ethical perspective built up for us by the movie as a whole, and you assessed it in terms of who is utilizing violence, the conclusion would have to be both sides. And so, according to Girard's schema for what makes tragedy function, this is a tragic film. The mechanism for scapegoating is the central mechanism determining who remains a part of the community versus who is eliminated from the community. And the use of violence mirrors the use of violence on each side mirrors one another to achieve the same goals. These are, again, according to Girard, the fundamental components of tragedy. And we get them in Hot Fuzz, ostensibly an action comedy.